Some things find you when you're not looking. The sun had barely breached the horizon over Camp Pendleton, California, and a thin mist clung to the edges of the training range like a soft blanket. The air smelled faintly of salt from the nearby coast, mixed with the warm metallic tang of the morning dew on the barbed fences. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, tall, broad-shouldered, skin deep brown from years under the desert sun, walked along the gravel path with a careful but purposeful step, his boots crunching softly against the stone. His eyes, a quiet hazel, scanned the empty field, every shadow moving just enough to keep his attention tethered. He had returned to the base only days ago after recovering from a shoulder injury sustained overseas, and the early hour was meant to clear his mind before the routine of drills and inspections began. A sudden movement caught his gaze, a flash of pure white fur darting from behind a weathered storage shed, paws skimming over the gravel, tail held stiff, eyes amber and alert. Marcus froze. The dog, a German shepherd with a coat as white as winter snow, moved with a precision and purpose that belied its youth. It paused mid-step, lifting its nose to the wind as if catching a scent only it could perceive. There was no hesitation in its stride, no fear. It walked directly toward Marcus, ears perked, head held high, and in that moment he felt a tug deep in his chest, a whisper of recognition he couldn't explain. The world seemed to still around them. The distant hum of trucks, the muted clang of metal gates. Even the sea breeze held its breath. Marcus knelt slightly, instinctive, steady, and the dog stopped a mere 2 feet away, head tilting, amber eyes locking onto his. The animal's gaze carried a weight, a story waiting to be unraveled, and a quiet insistence that Marcus could not ignore. He reached out slowly, hand trembling just enough to betray his caution, and the dog pressed forward, brushing against his leg, soft yet deliberate. A metallic glint caught his eye, a small, worn piece of leather in the dog's mouth, cracked and faded, and upon closer look, Marcus could make out a single engraved name, Hayes. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp grass and distant pine, and Marcus inhaled sharply, feeling the old ache of unanswered questions stirring in his chest. Snow, the white K9, nudged the leather toward him again, eyes urging him to notice, to act, to follow. The world around the training range, so familiar and mundane, became a stage for something unseen, something quietly profound. Snow did not bark, did not whimper, but its presence alone created a tension, a rhythm that Marcus understood in a way words could not capture. He knew the moment required patience, reverence, and attention, for the message carried by this animal was delicate, veiled, and deeply personal. The mist curled along the fence lines and through the trees, catching the early light in ethereal patterns, as Marcus finally crouched fully to meet Snow at eye level, letting the dog's steady amber gaze guide him into a narrative that had begun long before either of them had arrived at the range, a story of loyalty, of forgotten names, of medals left buried beneath years of silence. Snow's paw nudged the edge of the gravel path, an unspoken invitation to walk, to move, to uncover what had been hidden, and Marcus rose slowly, a sense of purpose settling over him, feeling the weight of history and the pull of destiny in the simple motion of a dog choosing a marine as its companion in the quiet moments before the world woke. Marcus did not call for anyone at first. Something in the dog's stillness told him that noise would break whatever fragile thread had been placed between them. He stood there with the cracked strip of leather in his palm, the name haze darkened by age and weather, while Snow watched him with the patience of a sentry who had already waited too long. The base was beginning to wake behind them. A diesel engine coughed near the motor pool. A flag line snapped softly in the coastal wind. Somewhere across the yard, a young Marine laughed at something ordinary, something clean and morning-made, and Marcus felt the strange distance between that easy sound and the cold weight now resting in his hand. He looked down at Snow. The white German shepherd had mud dried along one side of his coat, burrs caught near his shoulder, and faint gray dust on his paws, the kind that did not come from the trimmed grass near the barracks. He had been somewhere rough, somewhere beyond the neat fences and marked roads, and yet his eyes were clear. Not wild, not lost, chosen. Marcus turned the leather over. The stitching was old and handmade, the edges softened by years of handling. It might have been part of a collar once, or a strap from an old field pouch. The name Hayes had not been written with fresh tools. It had been there a long time, pressed deep into the grain, as if someone had wanted the name to outlast rain, sand, and forgetting. Snow stepped around Marcus, not toward the kennel yard, not toward food, not toward shelter. He moved toward the eastern service road that curved past the abandoned communications building and disappeared behind low brown hills. Then he stopped and looked back. Marcus heard a voice from behind him. "Sergeant Cole, everything all right?" It was Lance Corporal Avery Brooks, 22 years old, lean and restless, carrying a clipboard against his chest like a shield. Marcus closed his fingers around the leather. "Found a dog," he said. Brooks blinked at Snow. "That is one clean-looking stray." Clean is not the word. Snow gave Brooks a single glance, then returned his attention to Marcus, as if the young Marine had been measured and dismissed. Brooks took a cautious step closer. "Animal control can come by after morning formation. We can put him near the supply shed until then." Marcus did not answer right away. Snow's ears twitched toward the east, and a faint sound came from his throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a warning. It was low, restrained, almost grief-shaped. Marcus had heard men make sounds like that in hospitals when they were trying not to break. He knelt again, keeping his movements slow. Snow came close enough for Marcus to see a narrow mark in the fur around his neck, a pale indentation where a collar had been for a long time. Not recent, not careless, worn by loyalty. "Who did you belong to, boy?" Marcus whispered. Snow pressed his nose against Marcus's closed fist, where the leather strap rested, and for 1 second, Marcus felt the dog's breath warm over his knuckles. Then Snow looked past him again, toward the eastern road. Brooks shifted uneasily. "Sergeant, do you know that name?" Marcus stood. "Hayes." "No." But the way he said it was not true enough. The name struck something in him, not memory exactly, but an echo from rooms he had never been allowed to enter. His mother had kept certain stories sealed away when he was young. His father's service. The missing photograph in the hallway. The folded flag that never sat in a place of honor, only in a cedar box beneath winter coats. Isaiah Cole had been a Marine too, once. Marcus knew that much. He knew his father had vanished from the official version of family history before Marcus was old enough to ask why. He also knew that whenever he pressed for more, his mother's face would tighten, and she would say, "Some questions do not bring people back." Marcus had built his life around discipline because discipline did not ask questions. It gave orders. It gave structure. It kept grief standing straight. But Snow was not offering structure. Snow was offering a door. Captain Reynolds came out from the administration building with a cup of coffee in one hand and the morning roster in the other. He was a square-built man in his 50s, fair-skinned, gray at the temples, with the tired patience of someone who had learned that unusual mornings usually became paperwork by noon. He stopped when he saw the dog. "Sergeant Cole, tell me that animal is cleared for base property." "No, sir." "Then why is it standing next to you like it has orders?" Marcus looked down. Snow had moved so close that his shoulder brushed Marcus's leg. "I think he brought me something." Marcus opened his hand. Reynolds looked at the leather, and the mild irritation left his face. He did not touch it. He only stared. "Where did you get that?" "The dog had it." Reynolds was silent for a moment too long. Brooks noticed it. Marcus noticed it more. "Sir?" Reynolds glanced toward the eastern hills, then back at Snow. "There used to be an old training corridor out that way, long before your time here. Some records from that period are incomplete." "Incomplete," Marcus repeated. Reynolds took a slow breath. "I said what I said." Snow sat then, suddenly and firmly, as if the word incomplete had settled something inside him. His amber eyes fixed on Marcus with such quiet force that the mornings seemed to narrow around them. Marcus felt the strap warm in his palm. He did not know yet what waited beyond the service road. He did not know why a white K9 had walked out of the mist carrying a dead man's name. But he knew this much. The dog had passed trucks, fences, voices, and open gates. He had ignored every other hand. He had come to Marcus. And sometimes, when the truth has been buried long enough, it does not arrive with thunder. It arrives on tired paws, carrying a name no one was ready to hear. By noon, Snow had become the quietest disturbance on the base. No one called him a stray anymore, not after he refused every bowl of food placed near the supply shed and walked straight back to Marcus each time someone tried to guide him away. He did not bare his teeth. He did not resist with force. He simply waited for the nearest hand to loosen, then returned to the same pair of boots as if the rest of Camp Pendleton did not exist. Marcus tried to keep his expression unreadable, but the men noticed. They always noticed the things a sergeant pretended not to feel. Snow sat beside him through the late morning briefing, body still, white coat bright against the dull green wall, amber eyes tracking every voice that spoke. Captain Reynolds allowed it with a look that said the privilege had limits. Lance Corporal Brooks kept glancing down at the dog, half amused, half unsettled, as if Snow knew how young he was and had already forgiven him for it. Marcus stood at the front of the room, one hand behind his back, the cracked leather strip sealed in an evidence sleeve now, though the word evidence felt too cold for something that seemed more like a prayer. The East Service Road was off-limits beyond the old communications building until maintenance cleared a washout near the hillside. That was the official reason. The unofficial reason sat in the silence whenever Marcus mentioned the name Hayes. Men who had spent years around records and uniforms had a way of looking down when history became inconvenient. After the briefing, Marcus walked to the temporary kennel beside the veterinary trailer, hoping food, water, and shade might persuade Snow to rest. Dr. Emily Hart, the base veterinarian, met him at the door. She was a calm woman in her early 40s with auburn hair pulled beneath a cap and eyes sharpened by years of tending animals that could not explain where it hurt. She examined Snow gently, running careful hands along his legs, ribs, shoulders, and neck. He is underweight by about 15 pounds, she said, but not neglected in the usual way. His paws are worn, not from wandering streets. More like rough terrain. How long? Marcus asked. Hard to say. Days, maybe longer. She paused at the pale groove around his neck. He wore a collar for years. A working collar, probably. See how the fur grew around the pressure line? Marcus watched Snow remain perfectly still under her touch, but the dog's gaze never left him. When Dr. Hart stepped toward a cabinet, Snow rose too. When Marcus took one step back, Snow followed. Dr. Hart smiled faintly, but there was sadness beneath it. He has chosen you. Marcus gave a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. Dogs do not choose staff sergeants. They choose safety, she said, and sometimes memory. That word landed harder than Marcus expected. Memory. He looked at Snow and felt again the strange pull from the morning, the old leather in his hand, the sealed places inside his own life beginning to shift. Later, when Marcus sat alone in the small office assigned to him near the barracks, Snow lay under the desk with his muzzle resting across Marcus's boot. Outside, afternoon heat shimmered over the pavement. The base carried on in ordinary rhythms. Tires over gravel, commands carried on wind, a distant cadence rising and falling like a heartbeat. Marcus opened the top drawer and removed his own dog tags. They were clean, current, regulation. Yet behind them, wrapped in a soft cloth he rarely touched, was another tag, older and dulled at the edges. Isaiah Cole, his father's name. His mother had given it to him when he left for boot camp, pressing it into his palm on the bus. Station platform in Atlanta. She had not cried. She had only said, "Carry it better than they carried him." Marcus never understood whether that was a blessing or a warning. He unfolded the cloth now. The room seemed to dim around the small piece of metal. Snow lifted his head before Marcus made a sound. The dog's ears rose. His nose moved once, twice, catching the scent of age, skin, cedar, and something buried deeper than either of them could name. Then Snow made that same low sound from the morning. Not fear, not hunger, grief held behind the teeth. Marcus stared at him. You know this? Snow stood and pressed his nose to the tag. His body trembled once, so lightly Marcus might have missed it if his hand had not been resting on the desk. Then the dog turned toward the eastern window. Beyond the glass, the brown hills waited under the late sun, quiet and closed. Marcus felt a chill move through him, though the room was warm. He picked up the tag and held it beside the sealed leather strip bearing the name Hayes. 2 names. 2 pieces of metal and leather. 2 doors that had stayed shut for too many years. A knock came softly at the frame. Captain Reynolds stood there, his coffee gone, his face heavier than it had been that morning. "Sergeant Cole," he said, "I checked the old archive index. Daniel Hayes was real." Marcus did not move. Reynolds looked at Snow, then at the tag in Marcus's hand. And he was not alone the day he disappeared. Snow stepped forward before Marcus could answer, crossing the room with sudden purpose. He placed one white paw against the closed door and looked back. This time there was no mistaking it. He was not asking for shelter. He was asking them to follow. Marcus followed Snow out of the office, boots clicking softly against the concrete floor, each step measured, each glance exchanged with the white German shepherd carrying a weight far beyond any ordinary animal. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long stripes across the hall, and every surface seemed alive with quiet expectation. Snow's tail was low, moving slowly from side to side, as if balancing not just his own attention, but the gravity of what was to come. The Eastern Service Road stretched out ahead, gravel and dust catching the light like scattered gold. Marcus kept his hand near the leather strap, knowing the name Hayes and the tag of Isaiah Cole were somehow part of the path, yet unable to see how they connected beyond instinct and trust. The farther they walked, the quieter the bass became, as though the morning rhythm had been suspended in respect for what was unfolding. Snow paused at the threshold of the low hills, sniffing the wind, ears moving independently to catch sounds from behind the abandoned communications building. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze against his face, a mixture of salt, dry earth, and the faint smell of pine carried across the training field. He recalled mornings like this in the desert, when patrols moved silently before the heat struck, when every sound and shadow could matter. Snow lifted one paw, placed it deliberately on a stone near the side of the road, then looked back as if to confirm Marcus was paying attention. He was. They moved in a rhythm that felt unspoken, a language made of eyes and paws and breaths held in perfect timing. The first incline of the hills brought a stretch of scrub and coarse grass, dry from weeks without rain, interspersed with rocks bleached by sun and wind. Snow sniffed, then paused again, body stiffening, ears high, amber eyes scanning, muscles coiled for movement yet unmoving, waiting for Marcus to recognize the urgency. A distant hum of activity from the motor pool faded behind them, replaced by a quiet only punctuated by wind brushing over pebbles and dry leaves. Marcus noted the subtle flex of Snow's muscles, the tension in his neck, and the way he shifted his weight with a purpose that suggested memory, not instinct alone. Around a bend, they came upon the old training corridor, long closed to routine exercises, gates rusted, signs faded, and the sun illuminating shards of glass scattered across the path. Snow did not hesitate. He led the way down the narrow corridor, nose close to the ground, then rising to catch the faintest whiff of something buried. Marcus followed, careful not to disturb the small, delicate patterned snow. Traced in the dust, feeling an odd stillness settle over the corridor, like a pause in time itself. Shadows stretched long as the sun moved lower, falling across faded lines marking obstacles and old barricades, and the dog pressed forward, occasionally pausing to glance back, checking Marcus was still present. The pace slowed near a cluster of boulders that had tumbled from erosion, revealing a hollow space beneath, partially concealed by roots and wind-blown debris. Snow stopped, his body rigid, amber eyes locked on the hollow, then nudged Marcus with his snout. Marcus knelt, feeling the dust beneath his fingertips, cool and dry, and he noticed faint markings in the earth, impressions of metal and fabric long settled into the soil. He moved closer, brushing aside loose dirt, and saw a fragment of weathered cloth catching sunlight. Snow circled him once, then set his head low, gaze unwavering. Marcus carefully reached for the cloth, lifting it with hands steady despite a quickened heartbeat. There, tucked in the folds, was the corner of an aged box, metal dulled by rain and sun, and the unmistakable shape of a clasp glinting faintly in the afternoon light. Snow sat beside him, motionless, ears moving with the wind, eyes focused, and Marcus felt the quiet weight of revelation pressing down, not in grandeur, but in the slow, deliberate unfolding of truth. He reached for the clasp, fingers brushing the smooth metal, feeling the contours of time pressed into the surface, and the initials engraved deep within confirmed what the dog had led him to, a fragment of history, of loyalty preserved, of names once lost now emerging. The breeze carried a hint of salt and pine, wrapping the moment in a hushed, reverent stillness. Marcus breathed, letting the connection sink in, the path, the dog, the tags, all converging into a single line of continuity that had begun in memory and now found expression under the afternoon sun. Snow shifted slightly, pressing his side against Marcus's knee, and Marcus understood fully for the first time that the dog had not only found a lost object, but had guided him toward understanding, toward the unseen threads that tied the living to the past, that transformed discovery into recognition, and recognition into the quiet satisfaction of a purpose fulfilled. Captain Reynolds did not speak for nearly a full minute after Marcus brought the old metal box back to the administration building. He stood behind his desk with both hands resting on the edge, staring at the dust-covered clasp, the weathered cloth, and the fragment of leather sealed beside it. Outside the window, late afternoon had begun to turn the base the color of brass, and the shadows of the flagpoles stretched long across the pavement. Snow lay near Marcus's chair, but he was not resting. His head was up. His ears were still. His amber eyes held on the box, as if he had carried it in his own heart for years. Marcus waited because Marines learned the discipline of silence, but inside him, something was pressing against the walls. Reynolds finally opened a locked cabinet and removed a thin archive folder, its corners softened, its label faded almost to gray. He placed it on the desk gently, too gently for paperwork. "Daniel Aaron Hayes," he said. "Corporal, United States Marine Corps. Assigned temporarily to a training evaluation unit on this base more than 25 years ago." Marcus leaned forward. "And Isaiah Cole?" Reynolds looked at him then, and the hesitation in his face answered before his mouth did. "Same operation. Same day." Marcus felt his throat tighten, but he kept his posture straight. Snow rose without a sound and stepped close enough that his shoulder touched Marcus's knee. The contact was warm, steady, almost deliberate. Reynolds opened the folder. The pages inside were copies of copies, old reports blurred by time and handling. There were maps with grid marks, a personnel list, a weather note from a morning of heavy coastal fog, a statement that looked incomplete, with several lines blacked out by old review markings. Marcus saw his father's name before Reynolds pointed to it. Isaiah Nathaniel Cole. His father had always existed in fragments, a dull dog tag, a photograph with one corner torn away, a silence at family dinners whenever someone mentioned service, honor, or coming home. Marcus had joined the Marines partly to outrun that silence, partly to stand inside the uniform his father had left behind and prove that the Cole name could hold steady underweight. But now that name sat in faded ink beside Daniel Hayes, and Marcus could not tell whether he was closer to an answer or farther from peace. Reynolds turned another page. The official summary said Hayes became separated during an emergency field movement. Isaiah Cole returned to search for him against instruction. Neither man reported back to the checkpoint before the corridor was closed. Marcus looked up sharply. "Against instruction? That is what the report says. What does the truth say?" Reynolds exhaled slowly. "The truth is harder to file." Snow gave a soft sound from deep in his chest. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to fill the room with the ache of something waiting too long. Marcus reached down and touched the dog's head. The white fur was still gritty from the hills. He remembered the way Snow had stepped carefully along the old corridor, how he had known where to pause, where to lower his nose, where the earth had hidden its memory. A dog could be trained to track scent. A dog could follow a trail. But no training explained the reverence in Snow's body when he found the box. Reynolds opened the final sleeve in the folder. Inside was a small black and white photograph. Two young Marines stood near a training vehicle, both smiling with the guarded ease of men who had not yet learned what their names would cost. One was fair-haired, lean, with Daniel Hayes written neatly on the back. The other was a young black Marine with Marcus's eyes and Marcus's jawline, one arm draped around Hayes's shoulders. Between them sat a small white German shepherd puppy, ears too large for its head, looking up as if the whole world belonged to the men beside it. Marcus forgot to breathe. Snow stepped closer to the desk, rose on his hind legs for half a second, and looked at the photograph. Then he lowered himself and sat perfectly still. Reynolds spoke softly. The puppy was listed as a base-trained companion animal, name unknown in most files. One note calls him Shepherd White. Marcus stared at the image, then at Snow. That was not possible. It did not have to be possible. Some truths do not arrive to be explained. They arrive to be honored. He turned the photograph over in his hand and saw a line written beneath the names in faint pencil. Hayes says the dog always finds the man who needs finding. The room seemed to narrow around those words. Marcus pressed his thumb against the edge of the photo, careful not to bend it. His father had not vanished alone. Daniel Hayes had not been just a forgotten name on cracked leather. And Snow, this quiet white K9 who had walked out of the morning mist and into Marcus's life, had not come searching for food, comfort, or shelter. He had come carrying a chain of loyalty that had somehow survived years of dust, locked cabinets, and human shame. Reynolds closed the folder halfway, but Marcus placed a hand on it. "No, sir," he said, his voice low. "Not yet." Reynolds looked at him. Marcus stood, holding the photograph in one hand and his father's old dog tag in the other. "If there is more buried out there, I need to know." Snow moved to the door before anyone answered, paw set firmly against the threshold, head turned toward the eastern hills now glowing under the last light of day. Reynolds watched the dog, then looked back at Marcus with the weary expression of a man who had just realized history had returned for its missing pieces. "All right, Sergeant," he said. "At first light, we go back." Marcus woke before sunrise, the sky still muted with the pale violet of early morning, and Snow was already at the door, paws set firmly against the threshold, tail low but tense, eyes fixed on the eastern hills. The gravel of the service road reflected the first hints of light, cool under his boots as he followed the dog in silence, feeling the faint stir of adrenaline mixed with a strange comfort in the rhythm they had established. The air smelled of dew and salt from the nearby ocean, and somewhere beyond the training range, a crow called, its cry carrying faintly over the rolling hills. Snow led him past the cracked pavement, past the old obstacle course, where rusted metal and faded paint told stories of years of exercise and discipline, the scent of long-burnt wood and dry dust, layering the familiar air. Marcus kept the folder and the photograph of Daniel Hayes in his jacket, the leather strap pressing slightly against his chest, a constant reminder of why he followed the dog. Snow paused briefly at a familiar bend, sniffing, then moved onward, paws sliding over gravel and patches of dry grass, ears flicking to capture sounds Marcus could not hear. As they rounded the base of a low ridge, the landscape opened into a narrow valley, dry creek beds twisting through brown scrub and scattered rocks. Snow stopped and looked back once, a glance that seemed to confirm Marcus's attention, then turned and moved toward a cluster of boulders partially hidden by the hills. He pressed forward with steady steps, feeling the history in the soil beneath his boots, the quiet tension of knowing he was retracing paths walked by Marines long before him. The dog paused near a sun-bleached stone, paw raised, then touched the earth lightly, nose close to a hollowed section of the ground. Marcus knelt, brushing aside loose dirt, revealing a small metallic glint. Snow sat, attentive, silent, amber eyes catching the light as Marcus carefully cleared more soil and saw the shape of a clasp, familiar from the photograph, dulled by time but intact. He lifted it, noticing the subtle impressions of lettering, worn by years, yet still discernible. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it a scent of dry pine and aged earth, and Marcus realized the connection between this clasp, the photograph, and the folder in his jacket. Snow nudged the strap with his nose, as if insisting Marcus acknowledge the presence of loyalty and memory made tangible. They moved further along the ridge, where the remains of an old training shelter stood, its frame skeletal and worn by sun and wind, shadows cutting deep against the remaining beams. Snow led Marcus to a corner where the ground seemed softer, evidence of prior disturbances long settled. He lowered himself to the soil, paws flexing, nose tracing the surface. Marcus followed, brushing aside layers of dirt and debris with deliberate patience. There, partially hidden beneath a loose stone and a tangle of dried roots, lay a small, weathered box, its edges rusted, the lid sealed with the faint outline of old hinges. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of years and the sense that time had waited for this moment. Snow sat beside him, perfectly still, ears alert, tail curled lightly around his paws, watching as Marcus examined the box. Inside was a metal, tarnished but intact, the engraving still readable, a dog tag neatly folded beside it, and a small black and white photograph of Daniel Hayes, and a young Isaiah Cole, with a white German Shepherd pup. Marcus ran his fingers across the metal, noting the scratches and dulled surfaces, a record of effort and service preserved beyond notice. Snow shifted slightly, pressing closer against Marcus's leg, an almost imperceptible vibration of anticipation and trust. The early sun cast long shadows, highlighting the contours of the metal and dog tag, and Marcus felt a surge of understanding, that the dog had not only found the object but had guided him through a narrative of loyalty, memory, and the echoes of those who had come before. He carefully placed the metal and dog tag in his jacket pocket, keeping the photograph in hand, and rose, sensing the ridge behind him stretching with the warmth of morning. Snow stood beside him, gaze fixed eastward, as if waiting for the next step, the next chapter, a companion not merely in body but in purpose. Marcus exhaled, feeling the air move across his face, sharp with scent and coolness, carrying the quiet weight of discovery. They began the walk back toward the base, every step measured, the gravel crunching under boots and paws alike, the rhythm of man and dog aligned in intent, each silent footfall a testament to patience, trust, and the power of unseen bonds that had persisted beyond decades of absence. The walk back to the administration building took less than 20 minutes, but to Marcus it felt as if he had crossed the distance between two lives. One life belonged to the man who had woken that morning with questions he had trained himself not to ask. The other belonged to the man now carrying a tarnished medal, an old dog tag, and a photograph that made his father real in a way memory never had. Snow kept close to his left side, matching his pace without command, his white coat touched by dust and morning light. Every few steps, the dog glanced up at Marcus, not with impatience, not with pride, but with the solemn care of one who had delivered something sacred and knew the heart might not survive it all at once. Captain Reynolds was waiting outside the administration building when they arrived. Dr. Hart stood beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of her field jacket, her expression softening the moment she saw the box in Marcus's arms. Lance Corporal Brooks hovered near the doorway, trying to look useful and failing because his eyes kept moving from Snow to the old metal container like he expected it to speak. No one joked. No one asked the obvious question. The morning had become too still for ordinary words. Reynolds led them into the conference room and closed the door with care. Marcus set the box on the table. Dust loosened from its corners and spread in a fine brown ring across the polished surface. For a while, all of them simply looked at it. The metal lay inside, dulled by years underground, its ribbon faded but still holding faint bands of red, gold, and blue. Beside it rested the dog tag marked Daniel Aaron Hayes, and under the tag was a folded piece of paper sealed in wax that had cracked but not broken. Reynolds put on gloves before touching it. His hands were steady, but his face was not. This was not part of the earlier inventory, he said quietly. Marcus stood across from him with Snow pressed against his leg. "Open it, sir." Reynolds unfolded the paper slowly. The room seemed to inhale. The handwriting inside was small, careful, and slanted, the kind written by someone using a hard surface in uncertain conditions. Reynolds read the first line in silence, then stopped. His throat moved. Marcus understood before he heard the words that whatever came next would not be just information. It would be inheritance. Reynolds handed the letter to him. Marcus took it with both hands. The paper was fragile, but the voice inside it was not. "To whoever finds this, my name is Corporal Daniel Hayes. If this box reaches daylight, then someone kept looking." Marcus read slowly, each word landing with the weight of a boot step in a quiet chapel. Hayes wrote that the medal had been approved for Isaiah Cole, not for himself. He wrote that Isaiah had gone back when no one else knew the route was still passable. He wrote that Isaiah had carried 2 men to safety through the fog and then returned once more because Hayes was still missing. The language was plain. No grandness. No attempt to make saints out of Marines. Just facts written with a trembling honesty that made them feel holy. Then came the line that stopped Marcus completely. Isaiah Cole did not abandon his post. "He came back for me." Marcus lowered the letter. For a moment, the room blurred. He did not cry. Not yet. Some pain is too old to leave quickly. It rises like water behind a dam, quiet at first, then everywhere. Snow stood, placing one paw lightly on Marcus's boot. The gesture was so small that no one else might have understood it, but Marcus did. Stay standing. Breathe. I am here. Dr. Hart turned away toward the window, giving him the mercy of privacy without leaving the room. Brooks stared at the floor. Reynolds removed his cap and held it against his chest, the old gesture unplanned and deeply human. Marcus forced himself to read the rest. Hayes explained that Isaiah had found the white puppy near the training corridor weeks earlier, half-starved and stubborn, following the Marines from checkpoint to checkpoint. Isaiah named the pup Mercy because, he said, every hard place needed one gentle thing. Hayes wrote that Mercy would not leave either of them, not even when ordered back, and that the dog always seemed to know which path was safe, which voice was afraid, which man needed comfort before he could ask for it. Marcus looked down at Snow. The dog's amber eyes lifted to his, calm and shining. Not Mercy, not the same dog. That was impossible by the rules of years and flesh. And yet there was something in Snow that felt carried forward, as if loyalty could leave descendants the way families leave names, as if love, once given fully, did not disappear but found another coat, another breath, another set of paws. At the bottom of the letter, Hayes had written one final request. Please tell Isaiah's family he was brave. Please tell them he came back. Marcus pressed the paper flat against the table, his hand resting over the words. All his life, he had carried a shadow shaped like doubt. Now that shadow had a name, a witness, and a truth strong enough to stand in daylight. He looked at Reynolds. My mother needs to hear this from me. Reynolds nodded. She does. Marcus folded the letter with care and placed it beside the metal. Snow moved closer to the box and lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the ribbon. He did not make a sound. He did not need to. In that silent room, with sunlight falling across the metal and the old names finally breathing again, Marcus understood that Snow had not brought him a mystery to solve. He had brought him a wound ready to close. That evening, Marcus sat alone in the quiet call room with Snow at his feet and his mother's number glowing on the screen. Outside, Camp Pendleton had softened into dusk. The hard edges of the buildings turned blue in the fading light, and the flag near headquarters moved gently in the ocean wind. Somewhere beyond the barracks, Marines were finishing the day in low voices, boots scuffing pavement, doors closing, laughter rising and falling in brief sparks before the night gathered them in. Marcus had faced long roads, hard weather, empty rooms, and orders that left no room for hesitation. But nothing had ever made his hand feel as heavy as that phone. He had spent years wanting the truth. Now that he held it, he understood why some truths needed both hands. Snow lifted his head when the call connected, as if even the ring carried a scent. His mother answered on the fourth tone. Marcus? Her voice was older than he remembered from their last visit, warm but guarded, wrapped in the careful strength of a woman who had survived by folding pain into daily chores. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Yes, ma'am. It is me. Are you all right? I am. He looked at the medal on the table, the faded ribbon resting beside the letter from Daniel Hayes and the dog tag bearing Isaiah Cole's name. I found something about Dad. Silence came through the line. Not empty silence, but the kind filled with 1,000 doors locking at once. Marcus heard her breathing change. His mother, Ruth Cole, had never been fragile. She had raised him in Atlanta with church shoes polished on Saturday nights, bills paid late but paid, and a photograph of his father hidden where grief could not be questioned. She could quiet a room with one look. She could turn $1 into dinner and a warning into love. But when Marcus said his father's name, she became still in a way that made him feel like a child again. Marcus, she said softly, some things have already taken enough from us. I know. Then let them rest. He swallowed. They were not resting, Mama. They were buried. Snow rose and placed his head against Marcus's knee. The weight steadied him. Marcus began slowly, telling her about the white German shepherd who had appeared on base, about the leather strap marked Hayes, about the old corridor in the eastern hills, about the metal box and the letter sealed inside. He did not rush. He gave each piece room to breathe. Ruth did not interrupt, but he heard small sounds through the phone, the creak of a chair, a hand touching a table, a breath held too long. When Marcus reached the line written by Daniel Hayes, his own voice broke for the first time. Isaiah Cole did not abandon his post. He came back for me. On the other end, his mother made a sound so quiet it might have been a prayer, or a wound opening after decades. Marcus pressed his hand over his eyes. "Mama, did they tell you he left?" Ruth was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, the strength in her voice had changed shape. "They never said it plain. That was how they hurt us. They let people wonder. They let me sit in rooms where people lowered their voices. They gave me a box, a folded flag, and no peace." Marcus looked at Snow, at the white fur catching the lamplight like frost. "He is getting his name back. I promise you that." Ruth breathed in, shaky but full. "What made them look now?" Marcus glanced down as Snow's amber eyes lifted to his. "A dog," he said. "A white canine." Another silence came, but this one was different. Not fear. Recognition. "Your father found a white puppy once," Ruth whispered. "He wrote me about him. Said the little thing followed the Marines like he had been born with orders in his bones. He called him Mercy." Marcus felt the room tilt softly around that name. Snow did not move, but his ears rose. Ruth continued, voice far away now, crossing years with every word. "Isaiah said that dog would sit outside the tent of anyone having a hard night. He said animals know where sorrow lives." Marcus looked at the medal again. Maybe they do. The next morning, the base chapel opened early. It was small, plain, and sunlit, with wooden pews polished by generations of restless hands. Marcus stood near the front while Captain Reynolds, Dr. Hart, and Lance Corporal Brooks waited behind him. A video call screen had been set up on a small table so Ruth could watch from her home in Georgia, wearing a blue Sunday dress and holding a tissue folded neatly in one hand. No crowd had gathered. No ceremony had been announced. This was not yet the official correction of the record. That would take paperwork, signatures, and time. This was something more immediate. A first act of truth. Marcus placed the medal on a folded cloth beside both dog tags. Daniel Hayes, Isaiah Cole, two names that had spent too long in the dark. Snow walked forward without command and sat beside the table, chest high, head bowed slightly, his white coat glowing in the morning light that passed through the chapel window. Captain Reynolds read Daniel Hayes's letter aloud. His voice was steady until the final request. "Please tell Isaiah's family he was brave. Please tell them he came back." Ruth covered her mouth on the screen. Marcus stood motionless, but inside him something old and bitter loosened its grip. He had spent his life proving he was not the son of a man who had failed. Now, in the quiet of a small chapel, he learned he had always been the son of a man who returned. When the reading ended, no one spoke. The silence did not feel empty. It felt clean. Snow leaned gently against Marcus's leg, and Marcus lowered his hand to the dog's head. The fur was warm beneath his palm. Outside, the morning flag lifted in the wind, and the light moved across the medal until the tarnished metal shone for one brief second, as if it had never been forgotten at all. 3 weeks later, the official ceremony was held beneath a clear California sky, but it did not feel like a performance. It felt like a door opening. The small parade ground at Camp Pendleton had been swept clean before dawn, and rows of chairs faced a simple table covered in dark blue cloth. On that table rested the restored medal, the 2 dog tags, the old photograph, and Daniel Hayes's letter sealed now beneath protective glass. The morning air carried the smell of cut grass, ocean salt, and coffee drifting from paper cups held by quiet hands. Marines stood in pressed uniforms. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, and near the front, Ruth Cole sat wrapped in a soft cream shawl despite the mild weather, her eyes fixed on the table as if she were afraid the truth might disappear if she looked away. Marcus stood beside her, his dress blues immaculate, his posture straight, but his heart moving in ways no uniform could hide. Snow sat at his left side, wearing a simple working collar Dr. Hart had fitted for him, white fur brushed clean, amber eyes calm beneath the sunlight. No one had trained him for ceremony. No one had taught him to understand a medal, a folded flag, or the sound of a name spoken with reverence. Yet he held himself like a guardian at a threshold, still and solemn, as if he knew the ground beneath them had been made holy by remembrance. Captain Reynolds stepped to the podium first. His voice carried across the field, not loud, but clear enough to settle every restless breath. He spoke of records corrected, of testimony recovered, of 2 Marines whose final actions had been misunderstood by time and incomplete by paper. He did not dress the past in glory it did not ask for. He let the facts stand bare and dignified. Corporal Daniel Aaron Hayes remained to ensure others could make it home. Sergeant Isaiah Nathaniel Cole returned for him when returning cost more than duty required. The words moved through the crowd slowly. Ruth lowered her head. Marcus felt her hand find his, small and strong, the same hand that had once packed his school lunches, buttoned his church collar, signed permission slips, and carried loneliness without complaint. He held it carefully. When the citation for Isaiah Cole was read, a Marine Major Marcus had never met lifted the restored medal from the table and turned toward Ruth. For a moment, the field seemed to fall silent beyond silence. Even the wind eased. Ruth rose with Marcus's help. She was steady at first, then not, and Marcus kept one hand beneath her elbow. The Major placed the medal into her palms rather than pinning it to cloth. That seemed right. Some honors are too late to wear. They must be held. Ruth looked down at the medal, thumb trembling across the edge, and for the first time since Marcus was a boy, she said his father's name without sorrow swallowing it whole. Isaiah, she whispered. Snow's ears lifted at the sound. Then, in front of every Marine, every family, every witness gathered under that bright morning, the white K9 stepped forward and sat at Ruth's feet. He did not jump. He did not make a sound. He simply lowered his head until his muzzle rested lightly near the hem of her dress. Ruth looked down, and something in her face changed. The guarded years loosened. The widow who had been given doubt instead of answers bent slowly and placed one hand on Snow's head. You brought him home, she said. Marcus looked away because some moments are too private even when they happen in public. Behind them, Dr. Hart wiped her eyes with the back of one finger. Lance Corporal Brooks stood straighter than Marcus had ever seen him stand. Captain Reynolds stared at the old photograph on the table, his mouth set in a line that looked like regret learning how to become respect. The ceremony continued, but Marcus heard it through a kind of soft distance. Daniel Hayes's name was cleared. Isaiah Cole's record was amended. The letter was entered into the archive, not as a rumor, not as a footnote, but as testimony. Later, after the chairs were folded and the crowd thinned, Marcus walked with Snow and Ruth to the eastern edge of the parade ground, where the hills rose brown and quiet beyond the base. The same hills that had kept their secrets for a generation now looked ordinary in daylight. Dry grass moved in the breeze. A hawk circled high above. Somewhere on the road, a truck passed, its tires humming over pavement. Ruth held the metal box against her chest. She told Marcus she had spent years praying not for revenge, not even for answers at first, but simply for the strength not to let bitterness raise her son. Marcus listened without speaking. Snow walked between them, close enough that his shoulder brushed Marcus's leg and his tail occasionally touched Ruth's skirt. At the chapel, they stopped before the small memorial wall where temporary plaques had been placed while permanent markers were prepared. Marcus set Daniel Hayes's dog tag beside the photograph. Ruth placed Isaiah's medal beneath his name. Snow sniffed the stone once, then sat back, eyes lifted, patient and clear. Marcus crouched beside him. For all the questions that remained, one truth had become simple enough to hold. Loyalty had crossed years. Mercy had found a way forward. And a dog with no explanation had done what files, ranks, and silence could not do. Marcus rested his hand on Snow's neck and felt the warmth of living breath beneath white fur. You found them, boy, he whispered. Snow leaned into him, eyes closing for a moment as the late morning sun spilled across the metal, the dog tags, and the names no longer lost. No trumpet sounded. No one applauded. The wind moved softly through the flags outside, and that was enough. Some stories do not end with victory. They end with grace. And sometimes, grace arrives quietly, on four tired paws, carrying the truth home.